You've probably heard that the Vikings were masters of the sea, sailing across the Atlantic in their sturdy wooden ships. But here's something that'll knock your socks off. Thousands of years before the first Viking even picked up an oar, ancient Filipinos were already out there in the open ocean, catching sharks. I'm talking 35,000 years earlier, and no, that's not a typo. The Vikings, sure, they've earned their reputation. Those longships of theirs ruled the waters of Europe for centuries. But if we're being honest, there was another group of sailors, the ancient Filipinos, whose ocean skills made the Vikings look like they were just out for a weekend fishing trip. And hardly anyone even knows about them. While Vikings were still figuring out how to get their boats across rivers, Filipinos were already building vessels that could take on the deep sea. I swear, I'm not exaggerating one bit. The evidence is so solid it's almost embarrassing that we don't learn about this in school. By the time you finish this video, you might start rethinking everything you thought you knew about ancient seafaring. Oh, and before we dive deeper, let's see if we can hit 500 likes on this one. Make sure to subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future dives into lost history. Alright, let's set sail. So, let's start with what everyone thinks they know. The Vikings ruled the seas from around 800 to 1100 CE. Their longships could slip up rivers, cruise across oceans, and land on just about any beach they wanted. They even made it to North America a good 5 centuries before Columbus ever set sail. They built kingdoms stretching from Russia all the way down to Sicily. When it comes to shaping world history, there's no denying the Vikings left their mark. And their ships? Absolute masterpieces of engineering. The hulls were clinker-built, meaning each plank overlapped the next, giving the vessel strength and flexibility to handle rough seas. Because of their shallow design, they could sail in as little as 3 feet of water, pretty incredible for ships that size. A single longship could haul about 60 warriors plus supplies. They had both sails and oars, which meant they could move whether the wind was with them or not. And that fierce dragon carving on the prow? That wasn't just for show. It was meant to terrify anyone who saw it coming. Viking shipbuilding was more than technology. It was a tool of expansion. Those ships carried them from the icy coasts of Scandinavia all the way to Constantinople. They traded goods in Baghdad and built settlements in far-off places like Iceland and Greenland. The Viking Age was, without question, one of medieval Europe's greatest seafaring triumphs. But here's where it gets really wild. Around the same time Vikings were perfecting their ships in the 800s CE, Filipinos had already been mastering the open ocean for tens of thousands of years. Not just a few centuries, tens of thousands. In 2025, new research came out that completely rewrote the book on early maritime technology. Scientists found solid archaeological proof that ancient Filipinos were making advanced plant-based ropes and cords at least 40,000 years ago. And this isn't guesswork. This is real evidence pulled from several prehistoric sites across the Philippines. So why's rope such a big deal? Because you can't build a seaworthy boat without it. Rope holds the whole thing together, from tying the hull and rigging the sails to weaving fishing nets and securing cargo. Sure, the Vikings had rope too, but they also had metal tools, iron nails, and 2 millennia of shipbuilding wisdom borrowed from the Mediterranean world. Filipinos, on the other hand, were pulling this off in the Stone Age. Just think about that. No metal tools, no written guides, no global trade to swap ideas. And yet, they were crafting ropes strong enough to build boats capable of crossing 100 kilometers of open sea. And that's not a theory, they actually did it. If that blows your mind as much as it did mine, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We're building one of the biggest history-loving communities on YouTube, all dedicated to the stories nobody ever told us in school. We uncover stories like this every single week. Tales of civilizations wiped clean from history books, technologies that shouldn't have existed for their time, and cultures that shaped the world yet never got the credit they deserved. There are already over 1,000 of you here, digging into real, unfiltered history with us. If there's an ancient civilization you want us to explore next, drop it in the comments. Seriously. Your ideas actually help steer what we research and share next. Now, here's something most people don't realize. The Philippine Islands have never been connected by land bridges. Not during the Ice Age, not ever. Even when sea levels dropped, the islands remained separated by deep channels of open ocean. So, if ancient humans were living across multiple Philippine islands more than 40,000 years ago, and we know they didn't just wander there. They didn't swim. They sailed. They built boats. And it gets even more mind-blowing from there. Recent discoveries show that these ancient Filipinos weren't just island-hopping in shallow waters. They were out in the deep sea, fishing for tuna and even sharks some 35,000 years ago. Let that sink in. Deep-sea fishing means they had boats sturdy enough to take on open ocean swells, strong enough to pull in fish that could weigh hundreds of pounds, and reliable enough that they could venture far out and trust they'd make it home alive. Meanwhile, Europeans during that same period were still chasing reindeer and painting on cave walls. And hey, that's impressive art, no disrespect there. But it's a completely different world of technology. In Europe, it would take another 30,000 years before people were building boats capable of doing what the ancient Filipinos already had down to a science. So, let's talk about those boats for a second. In the pre-colonial era, Filipinos built incredible vessels like the balangay, large outrigger canoes that offered both speed and stability. That outrigger design, by the way, was a Filipino innovation. It kept the boats from tipping over in rough waters, a design so effective that even modern sailboats still use variations of it today. And these weren't just makeshift rafts tied together with vines. These were serious, well-engineered ships, multi-hulled, stone-plank construction, adjustable sails, and enough cargo space to rival the legendary Viking longships. Take the balangay of Butuan, for example. Archaeologists dated it to around 320 CE, roughly 500 years before the Viking Age even began. It measured about 45 feet long, carried around 30 people plus cargo, and was built entirely without metal nails, just wooden pegs and rope made from plant fibers. And here's the kicker. Evidence suggests boats like it had already existed thousands of years before that. Now, don't get me wrong, the Vikings absolutely deserve credit for their innovations. Their longships were tactical masterpieces. With their shallow draft, they could raid up rivers, strike fast, and disappear before anyone could mount a defense. Brilliant. But guess what? Filipino ships could do the same thing. The balangay's shallow draft allowed it to travel up rivers and skim coastal shallows just as easily. The difference? Filipino shipbuilders had been refining that technology for millennia before Viking culture even existed. So that raises the obvious question. Why isn't this common knowledge? Why are Vikings household names across the world, while ancient Filipino maritime culture barely gets mentioned outside the Philippines? The answer, plain and simple, is colonialism. And who got to write the history books? When the Spanish arrived in the Philippines in 1521, they encountered a thriving maritime civilization. We're talking full-blown trade networks that reached from Japan to Java. Filipino ships were sailing to China, Siam, and the Spice Islands long before European colonization. The Kingdom of Tonda, which controlled the area around modern-day Manila Bay, was a regional powerhouse with trade and diplomatic ties stretching across Southeast Asia. But that narrative didn't fit the colonial agenda. The Spanish needed to portray the locals as primitive to justify their conquest. So that rich maritime history, it got erased, buried under centuries of Eurocentric storytelling. Textbooks focused on Europe's firsts, while ignoring equally remarkable, and often much older, achievements from other parts of the world. Thankfully, in the past few decades, archaeologists and historians have started piecing the truth back together. Here's another jaw-dropper. Ancient Filipinos were using advanced astronomical navigation thousands of years before Europeans even figured out how to sail by latitude. They could read wave patterns, interpret ocean currents, and navigate by the stars. No compasses, no instruments. Polynesian navigation often gets celebrated, and rightfully so. But Filipino navigational knowledge was just as advanced, maybe even more so. The Philippine archipelago has wildly unpredictable currents and thousands of inter-island routes, so mastering that environment took generations of observation and teaching. The Vikings had their sunstone crystal, a clever tool that may have helped them navigate by polarized light. Impressive, sure. But Filipinos were traveling thousands of miles across open ocean using nothing but environmental cues and ancestral knowledge. That's not just navigation, that's science, passed down through oral tradition. So, Let's line up the tech side by side for a second. Viking longships were built with iron rivets and nails. Filipino vessels? They used wooden pegs and fiber lashings, material straight from nature, engineered to survive the open sea. At first glance, you'd probably think the Vikings had the upper hand. I mean, those longships of theirs are legendary. But here's the twist most people don't expect. The sewn plank and lash construction style used in the tropics was actually way more flexible and far better suited for warm, unpredictable waters. See, wood doesn't stay still. It expands and contracts with changes in temperature and humidity. When you nail planks together, the structure becomes rigid, and that stiffness can cause the wood to split or crack over time. But when you lash the planks instead, the whole thing can flex and breathe with the movement of the sea, and that flexibility makes the vessel a lot tougher in tropical climates. Viking longships were built for the icy northern seas and for quick raids up narrow rivers. Filipino boats, on the other hand, were designed to handle typhoons, weave through coral reefs, and travel huge distances across open oceans. Different worlds, different challenges, and both cultures came up with genius solutions to match their environments. Now, if you look at range, the Vikings managed to sail from Norway all the way to North America, about 4,000 kilometers. That's incredible. But the Austronesian peoples, which include Filipinos, took it to a whole other level. They spread out from Southeast Asia all the way to Madagascar on one side and Easter Island on the other, practically half the planet. We're talking about more than 10,000 kilometers of open ocean travel. The scale isn't even comparable. And here's the part that always blows my mind. When Ferdinand Magellan's fleet reached the Philippines in 1521, his ships were in terrible shape. They'd been at sea for months. Hulls rotting, sails shredded, crews weak and dying from scurvy. They were hanging on by a thread. Meanwhile, the Filipino boats they encountered were in pristine condition. Well-stocked, well-maintained, and crewed by sailors who were strong, healthy, and completely at home on the water. That so-called European technological edge people like to talk about? It wasn't really there. And get this, Magellan's interpreter Enrique of Malacca was actually the first person to sail all the way around the world, not Magellan. Enrique was Southeast Asian, possibly even Filipino, and he'd already traveled west from Asia to Europe on earlier voyages with Magellan. So when they reached the Philippines, he was basically back in his own neighborhood. He'd just completed the world's first full circumnavigation, quietly and without fanfare. But the history books? They gave the credit to Magellan's crew, even though Magellan himself died right there in the Philippines. And Enrique, by every logical measure, had finished the journey first. Now let's talk about speed. Vikings could put together one of their longships in a few months if they had a skilled team. That's impressive, no doubt. But Filipino shipbuilders could construct a balangay, a large wooden boat, in roughly the same amount of time, using nothing but stone tools and natural materials. No iron nails, no metal forges, just wood, fiber, and thousands of years of perfected craftsmanship passed down by hand. When you take into account the technology they had available, Filipino shipbuilding starts to look even more remarkable. Of course, Viking longships were unmatched as war vessels. Their shallow draft, rows of oars, and quick-launch design made them perfect for lightning raids on coastal towns and monasteries. They weren't trying to build cargo ships or explorers' boats. They were making fast, lethal weapons platforms that could strike, vanish, and strike again. Filipino vessels, on the other hand, were multipurpose by design. They served as trading ships, fishing boats, warcraft, and exploration vessels all rolled into one. The two cultures just approached the ocean differently. Vikings specialized. Filipinos generalized. Neither way was better or worse. They simply reflected different needs and different ways of life. But if we're talking about who really mastered deep-sea navigation first, that's not even a debate. Filipinos and their Austronesian ancestors were building ocean-going boats some 40,000 years ago. The Vikings? They started sailing around 800 CE. That's about a 39,000-year head start. It's not a competition, just an incredible reminder of how many ways humanity has learned to conquer the sea. It's not speculation. It's solid archaeological fact. So the real question is, why does this matter? Because history isn't just a list of dates, kings, and battles. It's about understanding how people across the world used their creativity to solve problems, and about finally giving credit where it's long overdue. For far too long, the way we've told history has been heavily centered around the West. That version has either ignored or downplayed the brilliance of other cultures, and honestly, that's not just inaccurate, it's unfair. It erases the achievements of billions of people whose ancestors did absolutely incredible things. Filipino maritime technology, for instance, stands as one of humanity's greatest accomplishments. These weren't societies with fancy universities, massive shipyards, or iron tools. These were Stone Age communities that somehow figured out how to cross vast oceans, navigate by the stars, and build ships tough enough to withstand typhoons. That's not primitive, that's genius in its purest form. And it's not just the Filipinos. Indigenous seafaring cultures all across the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and Southeast Asia achieved feats that European civilizations wouldn't even come close to for thousands of years. Take the outrigger canoe, an Austronesian invention that's still considered one of the most stable small boat designs ever made. Even today, modern racing sailboats use multi-hull setups that trace their roots straight back to Pacific Island innovation. The Vikings deserve the respect they get, no doubt. They were fearless warriors, brilliant sailors, and they completely reshaped European history. But they weren't uniquely gifted. They were one maritime culture among many, and when you compare them to ocean-going societies that had been perfecting navigation for tens of thousands of years, the Vikings show up to the story pretty late. Now here's the part that really ties everything together. In 2025, researchers began testing ancient Filipino boat designs to see how those vessels actually worked in real-world conditions. The Flow Project, that's what they call it, is rebuilding prehistoric watercraft using the exact same natural materials and techniques people had thousands of years ago. And guess what? The early results are jaw-dropping. Those boats are seaworthy, stable, and surprisingly fast. Modern sailors who've tested them are stunned at how efficient they are. This isn't just theory anymore, we're proving, through hands-on experimental archaeology, that ancient Filipino mariners built technology that could easily rival anything medieval Europe ever produced. The only difference is they did it tens of thousands of years earlier. So who really mastered the ocean first? That honor goes to the ancient Filipinos, and honestly, it's not even close. Who changed European history the most? Well, sure, that would be the Vikings. But there's a big difference between impact and innovation. The Vikings get remembered because they raided Europe, and Europe wrote the textbooks. The Filipinos get forgotten because colonialism buried their story. But the thing is, archaeology doesn't play favorites. Artifacts don't lie. Stone tools don't lie. 40,000-year-old ropes and woven fibers don't lie. The evidence is there, and it's only becoming stronger as more discoveries come to light. So the next time someone calls the Vikings the greatest sailors in history, tell them about the people who were catching sharks in the open Pacific 35,000 years before the Vikings ever set sail. Tell them about a civilization that spread across half the planet using nothing but their wits, courage, and Stone Age technology. Tell them about the maritime culture so advanced that, when Europeans finally stumbled upon it, they couldn't even believe what they were seeing. History is so much bigger than what we learned in school. And the deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes that human brilliance has always been global, shared, diverse, and absolutely astonishing. The ancient Filipinos weren't just part of that story. They were leaders. They were ocean masters long before anyone else even dared to try. And that's not some wild new theory or revisionist spin. That's simply history, finally told the way it deserves to be told. In the end, it's not about who came first, but about recognizing that the roots of human genius run far deeper and far wider than we were ever taught.